Greg, welcome to you. I think there's some confusion as to whether these numbers represent simply a slowing from a very hot trend or the start of a more precipitous downturn.
Well, I think what we're seeing is a reflection of the Delta variant. So there are concerns about the rapid spread of the Delta variants, and we are seeing that across a number of states, the health situation is worsening. We've always said that a strong and healthy situation on the health front is key to supporting a robust economic recovery. So what we're seeing is, I think, a temporary cooling of the economy that is reflective of those trends. And we saw it in the latest consumer confidence data, where consumers are a little bit more on edge because of the worsening situation. But I would note that there's still a hint of optimism in that consumers are still looking towards vacations in the next 6 months. So that reflects the fact that they're not necessarily completely going into reverse and pulling back on all spending. There's still some optimism out there in terms of the outlook.
Yeah, I guess there's so many differences now versus when these numbers first started declining last year. The stock market was tanking back then. We had no idea what was going to solve this. We have the vaccine now. The market's holding up. It's just turned into a growth trade in the meantime. So where are we in terms of GDP? This has to make Friday's jobs report a pretty high stakes number.
I think the jobs report is very important because it'll show us how resilient the labor market recovery is or isn't. It'll also be a key guide for the Fed because we know that the Fed believes the inflation objective has been largely met. It's expecting the inflation outlook to cool over the next few months, but it's still expecting to see some further gains on the employment front to reach that threshold of maximum employment, which will take time. But the September jobs report will be a good indication of how strong and how resilient the labor market is to this new Delta wave. I would also note that there's also a mix of emotions and reason in the current environment. There are some worries about the health situation, but there's also virus fatigue. And that's more reasonable at this stage of the recovery, where people are looking to resume a sense of normalcy, but they aren't there yet. So that is key to watch as to how people react emotionally to this virus fatigue over the next few months.
Yeah, or dread. To me, it's like the virus existential dread. I just want to ask you about inflation and what your latest readings on this are, because, again, we're seeing these numbers all over the confidence and sentiment data. There's a very high expectation of inflation. We know in real terms, spending looks even worse. Incomes look a little worse than even the nominal numbers are showing. And yet the Fed is sort of looking at the data and saying still a lot of this should pass as we get into next year. Is that going to be the case now that Delta is prolonging the supply chain effects?
I think we will continue to see inflation, core inflation in particular, core PCE inflation, which is a key gauge for the Fed, trend around 3% up until the early part of 2022. Now, that is somewhat sticky, but we are going to see other inflation gauges start to decline fairly rapidly. We think we're past peak inflation as well as peak growth. So the two will go hand in hand, in a sense, over the coming months. There is going to be some cooling of inflation. But as you noted correctly, supply chain disruptions are likely to linger for some time, and they will put some upward pressure on prices going out into 2022. So we are going to be in this uncomfortable environment where inflation is gradually cooling and demand is also gradually cooling, and that bodes a lot of question as to the strength of the outlook. We still see the economy growing about 6% this year and about 4.5% next year, so it's still a fairly positive outlook, but is one that has a lot of question marks around it given the recent surge of the Delta variant.